Hello, my name is Chris Flanagan and today I want to give you a look at my Seahorse 3.5 horsepower two-stroke outboard motor. So before I get on and look at the motor, I maybe want to go through some of the reasons why I bought this particular outboard. So I have a 3.2 metre Honwave airfloor inflatable boat, and my main outboard for this boat is a Yamaha 6 horsepower outboard motor. And the motor works well for me. On a nice calm day, I'm getting up to about 14 miles an hour with just myself in the boat. So I'm very happy with my primary outboard motor. But I'm going out a couple of miles from shore, and my worry is, should my primary motor fail, I would like to have a second outboard motor that I could put on to get back to shore, because obviously a couple of miles with the oars going against the tide isn't going to work very well. So when I was looking at the price of sort of good makes of outboard motor, for a 2.5 horsepower motor, you were talking about £550 at the cheapest with the motor on offer. When I looked on Amazon, I found this Seahorse 3.5 horsepower outboard motor for about £180. And I've sort of learnt in the past that if you buy cheap, you quite often end up buying twice. And this was one of my worries. If I go for this cheaper outboard motor, is it going to be absolute rubbish? And then I'm going to write off £180 and have to go and get a decent outboard motor. The other side of that argument was that this outboard motor, I'm planning to leave it and not actually use it, and really only use it in an emergency. So given those circumstances, is it really worth spending a lot of money on a decent outboard motor that I'm not going to use? Part of the cost with a decent outboard motor is a professional service every year. My Yamaha 6 horsepower motor cost me £60 to service this year, and that's going to be an ongoing yearly cost for service. So part of my thinking with this cheaper outboard motor, if I was to get it, service it myself and get 3 years out of it, not planning to use it, only for an emergency, that it would have paid for itself. Basically I would have paid the same for servicing the new motor anyway. So I decided to take a gamble on it and go ahead and get the Seahorse 3.5 horsepower motor from Amazon, and I'll put a link in the description of where you can get the motor from. So I did quite a bit of looking at YouTube videos, and part of the reason I'm making this is I got a lot of benefit from others' videos when I was thinking of buying the motor. There was a few bits that was recommended from some of the videos that I watched that you needed to do with the outboard when you got it. So one of the first things that was recommended was to change the gear oil. Basically whenever I opened the gear oil up to drain it, it was thick, black, dirty oil. So it looked like it had been used before, and this had been put into the gear oil rather than putting fresh gear oil in. So looking at some of the other videos on YouTube, I opened this up, cleaned out the compartment and put new gear oil in. Some of the other things that were recommended to do, it was recommended to change the spark plug, which I did. I'll put the link to the spark plug that I found for the motor in the description. Other things that were recommended to do were to check all the screws, making sure they're nice and tightly fitted. So I took everything apart, checked it all and put it back together. One of the things I noticed when I first bought the motor was that there was a real rattling coming from it when it was moved, and when I was taking everything apart, I found a loose screw that had been left in the outboard motor. So I was able to remove that. The other thing I found is the stop button on top of the outboard motor hadn't actually been properly secured, so it wasn't working. So I had to reattach the wires for the stop button. The other thing I noticed is that whenever I was taking the screws off to change the gear oil, that the screws, rather than being black themselves, had just been painted. So whenever you put the spanner on to loosen them, the paint came off. So, one more final thing to mention under that is it did come with a spare propeller. It came with a little tub to mix your petrol and two-stroke oil in. Unfortunately, the tub that they supplied, the lid wouldn't close. You keep rotating the lid and it was just loose at the end, and anything that was in it would leak out. So this was absolutely useless. So I had to buy a decent container for mixing the two-stroke oil with the petrol. And I'll put a link again to that, because after a bit of searching I found quite a nice one that allows you to mix it up on the go without any difficulty. So my first impressions of it weren't great. There was a little bit of work you were going to have to do. The quality of the motor wasn't great. And I think if you were buying this as your primary outboard motor that you were going to use, I would be quite worried about how long you would get out of it before something serious would happen to it. For me, again, I'm planning to leave this in the bag. I got a nice bag off Amazon to keep it, waterproof bag to keep it nice and secure on the boat. I still was quite happy that maybe I had made the right decision. Obviously, it was going to depend on how well the motor performed, whether I had made the right decision or not, because there's no point in me having a decent motor to not use and leave it to sitting in the boat. So I got the motor loaded up onto the bin whenever I was first going to test it out. And one of the other things, sorry, I forgot to mention, as well as checking all the screws when you got it, the motor wasn't greased at all. So whenever you tried to turn and rotate it, it was very, very stiff to turn. So I ended up greasing everything, all the moving parts. But you'll see when it's on the bin that it's still pretty stiff to turn. The handle on it is fairly flimsy. And in fact, a few times when I've been trying to rotate the motor with the handle has bent. So again, I don't think this is something that is going to last long term. And I think if you were planning to use it all the time, I would be worried how long it would last before it fell apart. When I got it up onto the bin, I was actually in the bin of water. I was actually pretty impressed with the performance of it. It seemed to be pushing a lot of water. Noisy compared to my 4-stroke Yamaha outboard, but again, that was something I was expecting. It got fairly hot. There was a lot of heat that came off it, and the other thing was the smell. Again, I'm probably comparing 2-stroke and 4-stroke. I don't have a lot of experience of using these products. I'm fairly new to boating, but it was a lot smellier, noisier and hotter than the 4-stroke Yamaha that I've been used to. And again, it's probably not a fair comparison to compare the two of these outboard motors, but when I put it on, it did start fairly well. I can't say it stopped fairly well because the stop button wasn't working the first time I put it on, but once I reattached that, it did start and stop well. So normally within 5-6 pulls it would start. Once it was warm, it started on the first pull quite reliably, so I suppose that was a good thing. It started and stopped well, and it pushed quite a bit of water, but it seemed quite noisy, quite smelly, got quite hot, and it wasn't the easiest, like I say, to turn. It doesn't have any gears on it, so if you want to go backwards, you can rotate the motor round 180 degrees, and it's meant to go backwards then like that. Again, that's something I haven't tested yet. And there's just one tilt setting. When you lift the motor up, there's a wee lever you can push across, and that lever leaves the outboard up in a tilted position. And again, you can adjust the trim of the outboard as well. So fairly basic motor, and I did get it to take it out for a spin, and I'll show you some of the footage now of my first use of this outboard motor. Okay, so this is my first test of the Seahorse 3.5 horsepower outboard motor. Okay, so I got to take the outboard out. It was a nice calm day on Strangford Loch, and I'd just been out doing a bit of fishing using my Yamaha 6 horsepower motor. On that nice calm day, I was able to get the boat up to about 14 miles an hour. So when I put the Seahorse on, obviously the boat didn't plane, and the top speeds I were getting were round about 4 miles an hour, varied somewhere between about 3.5 to 4.5 miles an hour. With the Seahorse, it was obviously quite noisy, and there was quite a bit of vibration from it. You could feel the heat coming off it, and it was quite smoky at the start. The other thing, I've struggled to get the handle in a good position. If you over tighten the nut that holds it, then it's not adjustable. And again, the handle needs to be rotated all the way around to keep it flat for storage. So there's not a good way. If you have it too tight, then you can't rotate it back around. And if you have it too loose, as I had it, it wobbled about quite a bit. But I had no other way than to have it on the looser side, because then I couldn't rotate the handle round from getting it out of the bag. And again, a few times when I tried to turn, because the handle wasn't great, it didn't give you that nice smooth feeling. But it did push the boat along, albeit at a fairly slow pace. But the pace of what it was doing was certainly better than the oars that I would have done. So, and again, I have a little clip off the bag that I use to keep the outboard in the boat, so it doesn't take up a lot of space. So I think for me, time's really going to tell on whether this has been a good investment or not. Again, I'm probably only going to get this out once a year or so, check that it's still working okay, and really only plan to take it out in an emergency should the primary outboard fail. And again, whether it works or not, or how long it continues to work for, time is gonna tell with that. So I hope you find this video useful if you're thinking of getting this motor. based on my very limited experience of taking this motor apart, putting it back together, running it in a bin, and one quick run out on a boat on a nice calm day. If you were thinking of buying this as your primary outboard motor, I probably wouldn't recommend it unless you had absolutely no other choice from a budget point of view, because I don't expect this to last. And I think it's going to be a situation of buy cheap, buy twice, almost certainly with this outboard. My situation for using it, like I say, time's going to tell whether that's a good idea or not. At the moment, I'm still happy with what I've got. Like I say, I don't plan to use this motor at all. I'm hoping it's going to stay in the bag and I never actually need to call upon it. But I do have a little bit of reassurance given that I'm fairly happy with how it starts, and I think in an emergency I would be able to get it started. And obviously if the tides aren't that strong, the 4 miles an hour that it generates should take me back to shore, albeit at quite a slow pace. So again, hopefully you found this useful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments.